that'd be fun.
Hey everyone, welcome to Community Roots, a place where we gather in community to talk about mental health so we can travel the journey of life together. I'm Samuel Richards.
I'm Julie Richards.
And I'm so excited, whenever we hike around, we go off the beaten path. We have a great guest today, Rotem Brayer. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm really excited. We've talked about this in the past, but Rotem, as I understand, you're an EMDR. I'm just kidding. It is EMDR kind of specialist. So I'm so excited to have you on this podcast. I know you've been talking to Mom over the last couple months. How about you tell us a little bit about your history? Kind of your history with mental health, how you kind of got into it, and where you come from.
Yeah, so I'm originally from Israel. In high school, I started reading Freud and Jung, and really was always interested in psychology. And then when I went to college, I kind of chose a different route. Kind of life led me to communication and management that I really enjoyed studying, but then the job I had after was really, really boring for me. And at some point, I decided to move to the US and do my master's in counseling. And that felt really, really good and still feels good. So I really enjoy my work every day now. I help people heal with the power of EMDR, which we're going to get into. So I don't need to get bored like I did in my previous job.
Yeah, where did that influence come from? Were you impacted in a positive way by EMDR, or did you just see through like other people's stories, like the impact it made?
Yeah. So first of all, personally, I started doing my own EMDR therapy while I was in basic training because I realized that, if I want to really understand that therapy that works a lot on a non-verbal level, I need to experience it myself. So that's what I've done. But I've also seen hundreds of people get healed from trauma thanks to EMDR. So I really, really liked my job before I was EMDR trained, but I really love my job now that I have this powerful tool to help people heal.
Yeah, something that Mom and I talk about from time to time is, lighting up the world. Everybody that you're able to kind of touch and influence in a positive way kind of gets them to light up. And then the people that they influence lights them up too. And kind of that impact goes out. So I know Mom has a ton of questions, but I did want to ask for those of us, for my friend in the room who you can't see her
my
here.
friend in the room.
Yeah. What is EMDR? How would you describe it? And what are some treatments that it works well with?
So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And the two letters, the EM, are easier to remember, eye movement. So it's a therapy that was developed in the 80s by Francine Shapiro. And in the early years of EMDR, it used to be considered kind of like a foo-foo kind of therapy that people thought it was weird. There wasn't a lot of research, but what clinicians observed is really transformation of trauma, as opposed to, in most forms of therapy, you teach your clients to cope better with the therapy. And with EMDR, we're clearing the trauma. So I was trained in 2017. So EMDR had been established at that point. There's a lot of research that supports the efficacy of EMDR. We have brain scanners now. We can really see the effects of EMDR. And it's really, really exciting to live in that era that, you see something works, but you also have very clear evidence, thanks to brain scanners and technology, that it actually works in rewiring the brain.
That's interesting. And so, like, essentially, we've talked about it in the past on episodes. Like, you use light kind of moving back and forth as you're kind of, I guess, sitting in a chair, and just, do you focus on the trauma at that point, or kind of, is it a use of meditation with this eye movement that kind of clears the brain? It's been, I have not heard that phrase, like, it clears the trauma, and I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it actually does, and which I know that if people suffer from trauma and they haven't experienced that kind of therapy, it might sound unrealistic. But as someone who witnessed it um, hundreds of times, and I'm sure Julie, you have too. Um, it's really really exciting. So what you mentioned with the eye movements, the light bar. So we have a light bar. That's a form of bilateral stimulation. So this is how EMDR started with eye movements. And the movement of the eyes, basically what it does, it imitates a natural healing mechanism that we already have in the brain that happens during REM sleep.
Hmm.
During REM sleep,
Hmm.
even though your eyes are shut, your eyes are moving really, really fast, and it helps to clear some disturbance from things that happen to us throughout the day. That's why, when someone is upset, they go to bed. In the next morning, they feel a little bit better usually. So when people get good sleep, their eyes are moving, not all the time, but during the REM sleep. The EM of REM is the same EM of
Hmm.
EMDR. It's eye movements. So eyes are moving really fast, and it clears some emotionality from certain things that happen to us.
That's really interesting. And you talked about, brain scans as well. How does that fit in? What does that look like from just a physical standpoint?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier about that this kind of therapy is it works not only on the cognitive and the verbal, but on nonverbal structures of the brain. So we have limbic system structures like the amygdala and hippocampus that where trauma is being stored. And I'm using my
Hmm.
fingers when I use the word stored because trauma is not really stored. It's not really a hard drive. Our brain is not a hard drive, but we use this analogy. And it's when we use the eye movements, it helps to rewire even these non-verbal structures. So it helps to enhance neuroplasticity, which is the ability of the brain to rewire itself.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly interesting. Are you able to see, like, in a CAT scan or something? I'm assuming that's something with your brain. To be able to, like, kind of see these changes, or maybe even these, like, lobes lighting up as they're affected.
Yeah, so I personally don't. I don't have this technology. This technology is still very expensive, so it's being used in research. But if your listeners are going to look up Dr. Amen's research with EMDR, um, they can see pictures of before and after. He did
Hmm.
research studies with police officers and really clearing the trauma. When I said clear the trauma, you said you haven't heard that before. Clearing the trauma basically means the rewiring of the brain. When you rewire the brain in certain way, as we do in EMDR, you are clearing the trauma. And Dr. Amen's research study shows these images of before and after EMDR.
And also, if people are familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, there are pictures of fMRI scans of showing like before and after. So all of the reactivity happening in the brain whenever we're traumatized, that it has a whole lot of charge, we'll call it that, like a charge in our brain of all of the fear response, all of the intensity of the memory. After EMDR, that charge has been released. It's been worked all the way through. And so then the same level of activation isn't present anymore.
Mm.
So that's kind
Right.
of the releasing the charge, the nervous system shifts because suddenly what was a threat and felt like it kept happening in the present can now be stored in such a way that it is fully processed and it's in the past now. It's not coming up as an ongoing trigger in the present.
Right. One of the most amazing experiences as an EMDR therapist is to ask the question, on a scale of 0 to 10, how disturbing does the memory feel to you now when 0 is no disturbance and 10 is the worst? And a lot of times we'll start a therapy session and we'll ask this question, and the level of disturbance, we call it SUD, subjective unit of disturbance, would be 8 or 9 or sometimes 10. And then when you process the traumatic memory, maybe after 30, 35, 40 minutes, you'll ask the same question and you'll get 0 or 1 or 2, which is really feels like a superpower.
I want to go into a little bit just for the understanding for our listeners that bilateral stimulation is ultimately left-right movement. And so sometimes it is through eye movement, through light stream, using a light bar, but it can also be through slow, or depending on what we're doing with it, if we're resourcing and supporting the nervous system to calm down, or if we're trying to activate the nervous system to move the activation, then we use a faster speed. But you can do self-tapping on your lap or crossing your arms, or kind of a butterfly tap on your collarbone, various, or even with your feet. So using that left-right movement, what Francine Shapiro found was that is what is bringing into the already innate ability of the brain to heal by using that calming of the brain. Left, right, both sides of the brain are brought into balance. So we're not only experiencing high activation, it's having a chance to come into equilibrium.
That is really interesting. I wonder, and I'm recalling us talking even about taking a walk or taking steps, like to kind of activate the right left. When you have folks come into your practice, or even, Mom, do you do EDMR? Oh my goodness, EMDR. We just had a joke earlier about EDM music versus EMDR. But do you do EMDR at your practice, or is it just something you've kind of researched?
No, yes, I use that with clients as well.
Whenever you both sit down with clients, is it like, what is that process like? Are you talking them through I know the light movement is there. Are you just like, flick on the light or tap your hands while you just kind of sit there and the body kind of naturally heals? Or are you trying to get them to relive and bring up some of these memories so that they're kind of at the forefront of your mind and being processed? Like, walk me through what that looks like.
That's a really good question, Samuel. And I guess the best question would be that it depends on the client and what their needs are. So there is a standard protocol that we go through that we learn in basic training, basic EMDR training, that we help bring up some traumatic memories, and that's how EMDR was developed for trauma initially. Now we know from research that it works for many other conditions. But we're basically focusing or helping the client focus on 4 elements of the memory. We are focusing on a visual image, on a negative thought, on emotion, and body sensation. And this is what we conceptualize as the memory in the neural network in the brain. So what we're doing, we're activating that memory, again, with the image, negative thought, emotion, body sensation, while we're exposing the client at the same time to bilateral stimulation, which helps with that healing mechanism that Julie just described a minute ago.
Samuel's like, whoa, mind blown. What is this? What does this mean? One of the terms that might also be helpful to bring into the conversation is that we work on a target. So there might be a target memory, and those are the channels that Rotem was talking about, was feelings, emotions, thought, negative thought, body sensation, any image that comes up. So as we name those and activate those and apply the bilateral to it, it allows it to kind of be untangled like that big ball of Christmas lights on Christmas Vacation. Instead of it being so difficult to process because it was too much, too fast, too hard at the time of going through it, we're breaking it down into different layers of it and allowing it to be wherever the brain wants to go with it. So the client stays out of the way, the therapist stays out of the way, and allows the bilateral stimulation to kind of explore whatever memories might be associated together. So someone could come in for the treatment of a traumatic event, maybe a car accident or a difficult abuse or something. But what comes up whenever the brain goes to bring healing to it was even an earlier memory where some of those underlying cognitive beliefs or memories associated it even before that event that they think they're there to work on. So it all overlaps for our brain, and it's trying to resolve in a generalization sort of way, all those layers. We don't know where it's going to go when we start. We just kind of organically let it unfold. And the therapist is there to guide the process, to help create safety in the room and resourcing of the client. So EMDR has lots of ways that it can be beneficial in a person's life. There's the resourcing aspect to give support. There's the reprocessing aspect to heal trauma.
That's interesting. I did want to take a moment and say Mom just made a reference to Christmas Vacation, and Rotem, that never happens.
I don't make references as often. He's often saying something or Sarah will say something and I'm like, who are they talking about? What is this? So that is noteworthy. That's fair.
It's interesting. So do you often pair EMDR with other forms of therapy, or is it good just even as a standalone?
Yeah, it's a good starting point as a standalone, and that's how we learn it initially. But it really integrates well with other therapeutic modalities. I personally find parts work. So it has, parts work has different names: internal family systems or ego state therapy. That blends really, really well. And also all kinds of somatic therapies, so sensory motor psychotherapy or somatic experiencing. Again, very similar modalities with different names, integrate very, very well with EMDR because we are working with body memories. And again, Julie mentioned the body keeps the score. So a lot of our emotions are stored in the body as physical sensations. And then when we're doing EMDR, we have to tap into these somatic memories. It's not just cognitive memories I think most people think about memories as something cognitive. We also have somatic aspect of the memory, what we feel in our body when we're remembering certain things.
Mm-hmm. And some of those modalities that you just mentioned, Rotem, are things that our listeners might be familiar with because we've talked about ego states, Pia Melody's model of different parts, the wounded child, the adapted adolescent, the functional adult. And also, we recently had an episode on embodiment and being aware of what our body is saying to us, what we're needing. And most recently talked about dissociation in the context of how much are we in our body or less present based on how we're trying to survive traumatic or difficult experiences. So all of that language, we're kind of helping educate and normalize humans to be able to have these conversations and know what it is we're talking about and what we're working towards as being a healthy human.
Yeah.
So what does the sensation feel like? I think both of you guys have experienced, EMDR. What does the sensation feel like as the patient whenever is it dreamlike like REM would be?
For some people, I would say it's very individual. It's a very individual process. So sensations can be, very common in the chest, right? When we're processing trauma, people feel it in the chest, but some people feel it in the stomach. Some people feel it in their back and shoulders. Some people feel it as a headache. And one of the beautiful byproducts of our work, we're mental health professionals, we're not doctors, but a lot of times we clear physical symptoms that were wired with the trauma. So for example, I'm thinking about someone who came after a very, very severe trauma that happened as an adult, and he started having headaches that same day, that until we cleared the trauma and processed, he had that headache all the time. Sometimes it was like in the foreground, sometimes it was in the background, but he had it all the time, and we cleared it. Another great example is someone who came to see me after years and years of going to doctors to try to figure out what caused his IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. And there was just like years and years of testings and medications that didn't work. And then we found these targets that Julie mentioned, these memories that we had to process. And once we processed them, the IBS went away.
That is pretty wild. That's seeming pretty intense for lights moving across the screen.
I know.
Well, and body sensations are really just a way of listening to your body. Of sometimes it's tension, sometimes it's something feels prickly, something feels tight, something feels warm, something feel like, all those are just learning words of sensation to describe what's going on in my body, where I feel constriction or stress and tightness or tension, where it feels sometimes foggy. We talked about that with dissociation. So it's just learning to describe what is going on inside your body with sensation type words.
Yeah, something that I think that we've routinely touched on in the show in general is just the connection of mind and body and how connected they actually are. I'd be curious, Rotem, how that patient came to you and said, like, how did you find targets that they didn't necessarily know were there? Was that just therapy leading up to it, and then it just kind of built into, EMDR, or was it something where it was like, I'm just trying whatever I got, what was that process like? Or I'm wondering from the perspective of our listeners who may be patients and stuff, who have an interest in this but don't necessarily know where to start. Or maybe it's somebody who's like, just boom, I've got it down. That was a traumatic event for me, and it comes up a lot.
Yeah, you have really good questions, Samuel. So again, it would depend on the client. So some of our clients come with very clear knowledge of what the memory is. That happened, and since that thing happened, my life changed for the worse. And so we know that. A lot of times we don't know, and we find it together. So my advice for your listener is find a good EMDR therapist, and we have our tricks to help you find these memories. So one of the tricks is called, some people call it float back, some people call it bridge. And this is a way to kind of float back from something that happened more recently to the actual memory where the problem or the symptom or the issue started. So I'll give you just a quick example what a bridge or float back is that when you ask a client, when this happened a couple of days ago, something that really triggers you, what do you notice in your body? And then the client notices that, let's say it's a pressure in the chest. And then I would ask the client to close their eyes and to float back to the earliest time they remember feeling like that feeling in the chest. And that will often land on a memory that a lot of times they didn't even realize that it impacted them.
Which is talking about the associations that the brain makes when it groups things together. The brain is always working on efficiency and templates. And so these associations come together. It kind of categorizes it in that way to ultimately protect us from any kind of danger. Like that gets earmarked or noted as, okay, that's dangerous. I want to be on guard in those situations. And so it gets kind of stored or filed in that way. and it will bring it up together. So when we go to clear a memory or the charge, all of the other times that it's linked to will also start to surface so that it can be worked on.
Pulling out that Christmas light ball.
Yep.
So I did want to kind of shift gears into just, the therapist. I know we have a lot of therapists who listen to the podcast. What are some things that you would tell, EMDR therapists or even, therapists in general about EMDR?
What I would say is that EMDR is a very relatable approach. I think that a lot of people have this misconception of EMDR is a protocol, is a rigid kind of form of psychotherapy. And that's how it used to be taught. And that's how it's still taught in some places. But when you want to really facilitate healing, one of actually the number one predictor of therapeutic outcomes is the relationship that the therapist has with the client. And that comes from years and years of research that we know, regardless of what therapeutic modality we use, the therapeutic relationship is the most important. And we have to keep it in mind when we're using EMDR, because what happens, there's so much emphasis on the protocol and following the protocol that people lose sight of other things that are happening in the therapy room, and I think they're missing a lot. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say to EMDR therapists is that they can be their authentic self. They can be their authentic therapist and individual as a person, and they don't have to lose that in order to be good EMDR therapists. In fact, you have to be that authentic self with taking relationship into consideration in order to do good EMDR therapy.
I love that. I agree. I concur 100%.
Yeah.
Ditto.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I'm curious, Rotem, to talk about your book, The Art and Science of EMDR, out soon.
Yeah, so basically these two things I just said, to be authentic, to be yourself, and to take the relationship into consideration, that's where I start. I think that people have to understand concepts instead of just following a protocol. That really, really helps. So I'm starting the book with just explaining what's going on in the brain in very simple language and very simple terms. So no need to memorize complicated brain structures. I do mention the amygdala, or the amygdalae. Actually, we have two of them on each side of each hemisphere.
Oh,
Mind
no.
blown again.
Both.
But really what we need to understand, that when we're doing EMDR, we are facilitating neuroplasticity, that it's kind of like we're enhancing a natural healing mechanism. So I'm starting with that. Then I'm talking about relationship. And then from there, I'm really taking it to how you can individualize the treatment for your client. It's not only scripts and protocols, but it's more about understanding what you're doing so you can do it better with your clients. So if you're, for example, you're using resourcing, so this is what we call phase 2 in EMDR. We help resource the client before we expose them to the trauma that we're going to reprocess. We want to make sure that they have the tools to regulate themselves, to regulate their nervous system. So once you understand that, really understand that, you don't have to follow scripts word for word. You can just do whatever makes sense for your client.
Just being present in the room and attuned and mindful helps you give that.
Exactly. Right brain to right brain. Yeah, that's where the healing happens, right? When we do right brain to right brain. So again, when we're focusing on every word of a script or a technique or a protocol or whatever we want to call it, we're missing that right brain to right brain.
Could you real briefly explain right brain to right brain?
Yeah.
I know I've got two therapists in the room that are like, who, you or me or you? No, I'm curious, Rotem. Let's hear it from you.
Yeah. So you know, we're we're verbal creatures, right? We think in language. Our broca's area, that's the part of the brain that processes verbal language, is located on the left side of the brain. And
Mm.
we're a lot of times we're stuck there. We're stuck in our verbal conceptualization of things. But when we're doing right brain to right brain, we're actually starting to feel what our clients feel. And I know it's
Mm.
kind of like a weird concept for some people, but there's a lot of really interesting research coming from Alan Shore, who talks about us being the psychobiological regulator for our client. We're letting the client borrow our nervous system. And if we're not attuned, I think that's a key word, attuned. If we're not attuned to what's going on emotionally in the client's right brain, we're missing a lot of the deeper work that leads to healing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And the left brain side is often the going on with normal life, how I function. And our culture is very left brained because it wants quick solutions, step 1, step 2, step 3, make it very clear, make it concise, and fix the problem. Whereas the right brain, where the trauma is stored, is more emotional, images, body sensations, all those things that we're working on in EMDR.
Exactly. And thank you for saying that step 1, step 2, because in EMDR we have 8 phases. And what I encourage my readers to understand is that even though the model was developed as a phase-based model, we have phases, and phase 1 leads to phase 2 to phase 3. In real life, we're not doing such linear work. I encourage the reader to adopt a more holistic view of EMDR therapy. April 11th.
Hey, not bad. Yeah, counting down the days.
Yeah.
Oh, I have to do my taxes. Well, this has been so great, Rotem. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. We do tend to end these episodes with gratitude and affirmation or a mantra of some sort. So I'm going to let you think about it for a second while I shout out some of the people that make this show possible. Thanks, Mom Julie, for funding this podcast. She does have a practice that you can check out at jhrcounseling.com. Steve Dodge, the one-man band, provided the theme song for us, and the fantastic Alexander Wells does all of our logos. Please reach out to us. We love to have people, talk to us and kind of start that, connection. And so you can email us, communityroots.pod@gmail.com, or our Instagram is blowing up thanks to Mom putting out some awesome stuff here. So, Rotem, what have you got for us? We were thinking, and if you want me to start, totally happy to, but a gratitude and affirmation, just something about, you that you're excited about or want to shout out.
Yeah, it's really, for a lot of people, it's really hard to live in 2023. There's a lot of bad things that are happening in the world, but there's also a lot of good things that are happening. And I'm thinking specifically about our field and about healing and about the work that we do, is that we have these tools now. We have this technology. We have these methods that can really help facilitate healing. And again, when I'm talking about healing, I'm not talking about, being a shaman or, a monk in India. We can do it in our offices. We can facilitate healing. We can clear trauma. And this work is amazing. And I keep being amazed every day by the work that I do, that some of my colleagues do, some of my consultees do. It's really, really rewarding to see people heal.
That's exciting. Mom, you got anything for us?
I'm just thinking about that, the seeking and the curiosity piece of being open to what those glimmers are of the things that we can notice, and to observe and see the moments of healing, because they can be really small little things that all kind of add up. And light up the world, as Samuel said earlier, of it that is there too. And so leaning into some of that of, yes, it's in therapy offices, and yes, it's in homes and workplaces, of just moments of connection, moments of healing, pausing to take a deep breath, getting in touch with our body, learning how to listen to what's coming up for us. All of that is possible. And I think that's pretty beautiful.
Yeah,
That is pretty exciting. I'm going to go more fun with it. And it's just in general the path. I just recently had a birthday, and just using that time to look back over like the growth of these last couple of years, and really this podcast in general, how we're able to have these really cool conversations about, technologies I didn't know existed, different paths, and really diving into some of these concepts has been really cool. So it's been awesome, even as I go through my own day-to-day with community roots and stuff, thinking about some of these lessons and even understanding the connection of mind and body has been pretty great.
And shout out happy birthday to Samuel.
Yeah,
Happy birthday, Samuel.
Yay.
Yeah, I'm 40 now. No, I'm just kidding. Not yet. I did want to say thanks so much for joining us this week. Thanks, Rotem, for joining us. I'm so happy that you were here. I will post some connections to Rotem in the show notes, but you can also check him out at emdartandscience.com. I'll make sure that all is there. We have links to his book that's coming out. You got to go to your therapist and say, hey, do you have the art and science of EMDR?
There you
go. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We will get to you next week.